We'll let Amyas pour his water. Right, well, good morning. Welcome to the Work and Pensions Committee. We have apologies from the chair, who is unavoidably away, so he's asked me to step into the breach. So we're here to look at overpayments of carers allowance. Could we perhaps start, Sir Amyas, by you introducing yourself and your colleague?
Well, thank you very much. And I should say that I had the courtesy of a letter from the chair, so I fully understand the circumstances, but it's very kind of him to take the trouble to write. I am the Comptroller and Auditor General for a little bit longer, and this is my colleague Joshua Reddaway, who's a director at the National Audit Office and who actually did all the work of putting this document that you're looking at together. So I shall lean on him heavily for detail and accuracy in the answers. I was proposing that the division of labour would be that I would make the indiscreet remarks.
We're hoping you'd be demob happy and would be even more frank than normal, Amyas. So. Okay, so can we perhaps start? I think it's pretty clear from your report that the department is now detecting overpayments that it probably could and should have picked up earlier. I mean, is there a case that actually DWP should be writing some of this debt off, given they probably could have done more to stop people getting into this situation?
Well, I think I can understand that doing a sort of broadcast writing off policy might create quite awkward precedents for the department. But what I think they could think about, and I would say the committee might urge them to think about, is looking at this from an administrative point of view and saying, well, where there are relatively low amounts to be recovered over a very long period of time from people with quite low incomes, they might take a view that it's really not kind of good use of administrative resource to do that. So rather than saying, well, we're going to sort of write a ticket here, which might quite complicate things in the future, I think I would ask them to consider something along those sort of lines, which might, come out to quite a satisfactory result.
So when you say relatively low amounts, are you saying if it's less than, I think 65 is where they currently set the threshold, isn't it? What are you saying that could be?
Well, I think to say to the department, you should just give a blank check. There are some situations where there are quite larger amounts at play, and where I think you might say, well, it's difficult for the department to agree to write those off, and I think it's sensible to say, well, they can look at individual circumstances there.
It's quite a task, though, isn't it? I mean, if you said anything less than £250 we won't chase, it's quite easy just to wipe it from the system, isn't it? If you've got to review every individual case, that would... I would be I mean, if it was up to me, and it's not, writing off is clearly a decision for the department. I would be inclined. I'd be inclined to think, well, why don't we look at this on a de minimis level and say, well, look, there are taking that approach. There seem to be quite a large population of people where it doesn't make sense to pursue them for what will be a very long tail of pursuit. And I would have thought at very least that was not an unreasonable thing to suggest.
If I may, so the kind of discretion that the Secretary of State and the Civil Service have here are really in how they apply it on a case-by-case basis. There's also there is something called the SMOP, the small overpayment limit, that is £65. In the past, that meant that any overpayments of just a week were automatically written off because they're not worth collecting. Because of that stayed the same, and inflation on carers allowance now means that everything will actually fall over that, so they will in future be collecting everything. That's something, that limit's not just for carers allowance, it's for everything. I think it's interesting that only 1 in 80 of the debts being collected have actually applied for a hardship allowance. Under the hardship rules, the department mostly says, yes, okay, we will reduce the amount we're collecting week by week against your benefits. They also are entitled, according to the manual that they helpfully publish, to consider the waiving the debt. And you can kind of imagine more effort being put into publicise that, and more effort being put into how they actually have those conversations with individuals about how you, what are your circumstances, can you really afford this? In these circumstances, on a case-by-case basis, we'd be happy to waive this debt.
So when you qualify the department's accounts, Amyas, isn't that, if I remember rightly, that's because they're not spending money as it's intended by Parliament, i.e. they're spending it on fraud and error, not on actual benefits people entitled. I mean, would you not be... I mean, are you saying to them, if you did that and started writing off, then we'd qualify your accounts on that basis, or would that be a solution you'd be accepting if you were still around to do their accounts?
No, I'm not going to negotiate my audit opinion in the committee here, but actually the amounts involved are most unlikely to be material, and we wouldn't regard it as... I mean, the reasons on which I qualify, which are regularity, are because there are very, very large sums involved here. So I don't think something of this sort. The only times in which I pick out relatively small amounts that I might still qualify for is when I think that there needs to be some exemplary qualification because of something which is sort of wrong behaviour. Something like this where the department used its discretion in what to me would be a sensible way. I'd be pretty confident my predecessor, as I suspect it would be, wouldn't take that view.
And then, I think I'm right in saying that one of the bizarre situations here is that if they recover an overpayment of carer's allowance, for some claimants they just have to then go and pay the actual disabled person their disability premium. So you're just picking money off one people in a very expensive way to go and actually pay it out to somebody else. I mean, is there a way of shortcutting that system so we could just not do either and leave things how they've stood, or is that...
I think it would have to be... I think both parties would have to acquiesce in that. I think that's right, isn't it? And therefore, you know, that makes it something that would have to happen by explicit election rather than in any other way. That makes it quite complicated to do at volume.
So, if I may, there are instances of overlapping benefits and complexities here where it's possible that the same individual that receives a carer's allowance has, because their carer's allowance is found to be ineligible, they were actually should have been eligible for something else, and that they would actually get a top-up of the other benefit. Those are netted off, and that's done. It's only in situations where it's going to another person. You've also got to think about it from their point of view. Now, there is a debt aversion. People may not want the debt, and may want to have it netted off. But actually, the oddity here is the taxpayer has paid out a large amount of money over a long time that should not have been paid back. It is then seeking to reclaim that, potentially over a long period of time. And on top of that, is that now having to pay a lump sum payment to another party. So from the household point of view, they've got 2 worths of benefit and a long trail of payments going forward. So from the taxpayer's point of view, they have paid out twice and trying to reclaim.
Okay, thank you. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'll maybe take Sir Amyas's advice and ask Joshua the question first to steer. I think that one of the things that sticks out in the report and one of the problems you've identified is the staff shortages in the department. So just to ask you, what did you uncover about why these staff shortages are taking place?
So we set out in paragraph 3.5 in the report... sorry, I've got that wrong. 3.9, I meant. Some of the reasons. It's a whole host of unfortunate circumstances coming together. And the department does try to, as it says, as it calls it, manage supply and demand here. It clearly underestimated the rapid growth in carers allowance, which has essentially doubled over the last 10 years. It underestimated the kind of attractiveness of working elsewhere in the village, and I think anecdotally we're hearing some of the pressures of where staff were going to on sites, and I think that's something that you could explore with the department of exactly what was going on there. I think we felt when we were reviewing these processes that it was worth recording that they, as they put it, they're not meeting productivity targets. What they really mean is that these are quite old-fashioned, slow, ineffective processes that they're having to run. And there are a number of places where there are duplication and so on in them. There's certainly an opportunity to improve what's going on here.
Well, that probably comes on to my next question, then Joshua. I mean, are you now confident that the department's got the resources in place to administer this allowance, carers allowance, effectively, and to provide a good level of service to claimants, or do you think they've still got some way to go?
I have to be sceptical. 3 parts really in answering that. The first is just the kind of resource position the department's in. So we're actually talking about relatively few staff that are needed in this space. We've been talking dozens. An investment of 33 staff was a big deal in the compliance here in a department of 75,000. However, the total headcount has come down quite a lot in the last 5 years. The resource position for the department going forward is going to be tight. Again, worth asking the department exactly what's going on there. We were particularly, they've invested in a new system called VEPS. VEPS is a really interesting system. It's going to highlight many more potential things that, if investigated, could find overpayments. That's only going to work if it's properly staffed, and actually it looks like at the moment that it will increase the workload that the department faces. That's a good thing, but only if it's properly staffed. At the moment it looks okay, but it's too early to tout that as a complete success until we know that it is, whether or not it's properly being staffed and actually properly working.
And is there anything in your view then, Joshua, that the department can do to learn the lessons about how it's allocating its resources and administrating this benefit?
Well, we would see this within kind of like the overall approach to fraud and error that we've been advocating for some time and the department is trying to do, which is essentially you try to identify the risks of fraud and error, you try to put in place controls that do that, you measure what's going on, and you keep on doing this in an iterative process. Within that, we would expect to see individual resourcing decisions being made that's trying to find the right balance between, clearly you can try and reduce fraud and error to the nth degree and it not be value for money to do so. But in this instance, I think this is a really good case study of where the department was failing to find that sweet spot between the two and didn't really have that cycle in place. What it did have was a programme to try and improve the technology, and it has been improving the technology. But if you're not doing balancing both sides and really testing what works and what's the right level of resource to put in, then it's not going to work.
Just
I was going to ask if there was anything you wanted to add.
Just to say
just on staff shortages.
What's not all right is creating a wave pattern and then expecting people to pay up. If you don't manage to get get onto these things when you need to get the work done on time, to pick up over and under payments reasonably quickly, then you have larger balances building up. And then all these questions of equity and fairness to people who really are not well off, not really able to absorb. It's not good for these variations to have to be absorbed by people who are on these allowances. It's not a desirable state of affairs. So really it does need to be handled on a reasonably timely basis, and that's particularly true when this sort of cliff edge penalty can occur. So you could suddenly find people, going from qualifying for this allowance to not qualifying in a relatively short step. Letting that develop over a period of time can mean quite large sums of money relative to the circumstance of the people who have to pay them. And I think that really that's the reason you need to resource it consistently and make sure you're steadily dealing with everything on time. You just can't let that keep building up. Otherwise, you'll have complaints coming to the committee on a regular basis if this isn't handled properly. Yeah.
So, in the view of your organisation, then, Sir Amyas, are the department learning the lessons of the under-resourcing of carers allowance benefit?
Well, we think they are. They're certainly listening. We're not accusing them of not listening. But what I do think, and forgive me just to go on a bit on this, is what I do think is that there are other lessons here in the case. These issues have been being flagged up for some time. They didn't get a reaction, didn't get a timely reaction. It took some time for the department to get out of the blocks and start doing something about this. They're doing it now, but actually Internal Audit was flagging this up quite some time ago. They should have been moving on this earlier. And that's the real lesson is when you start hearing signals, don't take a long time to react, because it does create this unsatisfactory position in, when you're looking at the circumstances of people, who've got very little resource. So there are lessons there about listening, being receptive, not having a tin ear when you're getting told that things are going wrong. And I think that's quite serious.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Seamus. That's very helpful.
Ruth?
Sure, of course.
Thank you, and thank you very much for that. I mean, there's been various reports that a lot of the concern has only been raised due to whistleblowing within the department itself. Were you given access to reports by any whistleblowers within the Carers Allowance unit and concerns that they'd been raising either now or in the past?
Go on, Joshua.
Actually, the whistleblower has given us permission to say that we have been speaking to the whistleblower directly. So, yes.
And presumably that there have been cases raised sort of historically, not just at this present time. And take what you're saying, Sir Amyas, about the need to not have a tin ear. Do you think that the procedures are in place for people to raise serious concerns about how people are being treated, and then to make sure that those whistleblowers themselves who are raising genuine concerns about the people they're dealing with are protected going forward, to make sure that they can keep their jobs and they don't suffer any victimisation?
Well, I think now I have confidence that the department has those procedures in place, but what I would say is it shouldn't need the whistleblowers to have to be very persistent and determined in order to get a hearing. There needs to be a quicker reaction time, because it's pretty tough on a whistleblower to say you're going to get heard only if you keep on and on. I think that's unfortunate. It needs to be I am the sort of backup receiver of whistleblowing virtually across the whole of the civil service, so we get a lot of this, and it's a pretty tough ask to be a whistleblower. And I think it's quite important to recognise how hard that is, and to make it difficult to be heard and be reluctant to listen. I think that makes it even tougher. People, we have a responsibility to whistleblowers, but when they bring messages to us, we need to, I'm speaking generally, departments need to react to them quite quickly, so the whistleblower doesn't have to go. There's a sort of route of alienation from the department. It means that the price for the whistleblower goes up and up as time goes by, and therefore it's really important to listen quickly, to react quickly.
If I may, there are kind of three distinct periods in this case. There's kind of the period between 2010 and 2016 when this whistleblower was raising issues directly with management and felt that they were not getting heard. It's interesting that at that time is one of the period when the RTI feed in particular was not being resourced properly, and quite a lot of the issues go back to then. There's a period in 2016 when he raised specific issues. Those is kind of the time when the backlogs were starting. The internal audit report the first time gave limited assurance, quite strong words from internal audit, and then again internal audit looked at 2017 and again gave limited assurance and said these backlogs are actually growing, you've really got to deal with that. I think certainly whistleblower told us that they did not feel that was very adequately dealt with at that time. There is then the third phase, which I think is kind of 2018 and contacting essentially the new management of DWP. Of course, you've then got the committee hearing here in November, which I think is also, if not influential, at least coterminous with the increase in management oversight of what's going on and our investigation.
I put my money on influential, personally.
Yeah.
Glad to hear it then.
Indeed. So I think it is definitely illustrative of the fact that things could have been raised and escalated. Well, they were escalated, but they could have been taking attention earlier.
So basically it wasn't until the whistleblower came to members of this committee and issues were raised both here and on the floor of the House that any action was taken by the department.
Well, I think the department, to be fair to the
Effective
department,
action.
they were starting to move. They were starting to move before that, but the lesson is, move faster, be more ready to receive these messages. That I would say that's definitely the lesson.
So you can see, for example, if you look at the way they tackled the backlogs, they did start to take action after the second internal audit, 2017, to deal with the new claims, but missed that the outstanding changes in circumstances backlog was continuing to grow, and they were not taking that much action on the compliance work. But that's because I think they had quite a lot of faith in the new system that are waiting for VEPs to come in. It's kind of, you're taking it piecemeal rather than looking at it in the round.
I also probably just need to apply a bit more imagination to what it's like being on the receiving end. It's really important.
The receiving end of the benefit system.
Well, that's right. Waiting and relying on a system and letting backlogs roll up and then wanting to enforce them. You just need to keep thinking about what that's like to receive that.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Chris, can we?
Yes, Dave. Thank you. Joshua, I think you've touched on some of this in answers to Ruth, but just that, given that the majority of overpayments are caused by the claimant not telling the department that their earnings have gone over the limit, meaning that, and how the department deals with this is a claimant error. Given that the volume of cases that there are, doesn't the DWP also have a responsibility to tackle this and look at its communication with claimants, for example?
So, I can answer. Yes, I mean, what we would hope is that the department's acknowledged that it can work in its communications. We've actually put an example in the report of one of the letters, and I think, when I read it, I'm a chartered accountant and I'm reading it and I can go, well, it looks perfectly clear, but to be honest, I'm not the target audience. I don't, it's how these things land out there in people's lives and whether or not they're properly taking it on board. And I think that's why the department told us that they are actually keen to look at this. I think that, given my hesitation that I'm reading it and I have one reaction, I don't know what people's proper understanding is, because the department doesn't know what the proper understanding is out there of these rules. And I think that's where we would want to see a bit more.
Can I just add something to that? I think the department's making a decent effort at communicating here. The problem is not that. And I'm going to sound like a broken record here, all right? But I think you've got to imagine that you're someone out there who's got irregular earnings, who's going to find that they have perhaps not the most organised life in the world, and so they've got your communication, but they just happen to, so their earnings bump up and down, or they don't quite know what's being put through in the automated in the automated tax return, and they find themselves going above the limit by even a small amount of money, and they're immediately penalised. Having a system like that makes it easy for distress to be created by quite small errors. So when you're saying, do you understand this and can you cope with it, are not quite the same question. So I'm not so much we're not really accusing the department of not trying to communicate. What we're saying is they've got a system with a cliff edge, which means that people can get caught out whether you're communicating or not quite easily when they have this sort of lifestyle.
I think I should also just add, within that large number of detected overpayments, there are a large number of ones where they clearly knew the rules and did not follow them, and
sure.
and also some of the largest were because people simply were not providing care. But you see that you can't take it as a mass.
We're not
could be over
providing
£10.
cover before.
I mean, if you're over the limit by £10, you could end up being penalised, because of their particular
so there will be people,
working situation and working pattern.
As far as we could tell, looking through the data, there were certainly people who were massively over, and there were some people that were just slightly over, and there were quite clearly some that would have been caught out.
Okay, thank you.
Rosie, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to talk about that a bit more as well, because you touched on people having chaotic lives, and if someone is juggling care for someone at home and unstable work, are they supposed to communicate with the department on a weekly basis, or to phone in and to find the time to say, well, I've had an extra hour's work, or someone offered me something last week? And are they meant to stay in touch that often? Do they know that the rule, you were saying if they sort of went over it, how clear is that, and how do they manage that really on a practical level?
So the rules are they're meant to phone up or write to the
So even with an hour's
unit.
extra work, or what's this limit? There's a thing about them going over the limit. Is that a earnings limit or a work hours limit?
It's the earnings limit.
Okay.
It's quite low at around £120, and there are the extra complications that certain things are allowed. So it's a net earnings. 50% of pensions contributions are allowed to be deducted, 50% obviously not. There are certain expenses you're allowed to deduct. You basically get to the situation where the best thing to do is, if you're not sure, is to phone up and ask, and
so
hope
would be
you get
someone
good
there
advice.
who could advise on an even quite complicated case and get it right, and then they wouldn't be being penalised for being overpaid? Or do you think that those mistakes might happen because someone isn't quite sure on the end of the phone?
It's not something we audited.
Okay.
So I'm told that the person on the end of the phone is meant to provide that advice.
But then
I was quite interested in some of the evidence given by Carers UK here about that. They would know better.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Steve.
Thanks. I just want to go back to the whistleblower for a couple of moments. I mean, I read that these suggestions that something was wrong, the report to senior managers and eventually up to permanent secretary, took place over 6 years. Did the department offer any explanation of why it took so long for them to actually look at it?
I think part of the issue is the department thought that it had looked at it because it put in place these internal audits. I'm just not convinced that, and the internal audit reports raised the right issues. And the management took some of the right actions. It's just, I think it's really about a level of prioritisation during that time. And did they put in place enough? So did they say, this internal audit report says I need more people, therefore I need to put more people in? Well, they put some of the people into some of the process, but not all of the people into all of the processes. And that's essentially what happened.
I guess I'm trying to understand, sure it was a question of priorities, but did they offer any explanation? Did someone conclude it wasn't that important?
There's nothing I can point to that would...
Okay, there wasn't any...
But to be fair, it's important to realise that the whistle, and Joshua explained this earlier, that there are there were stages of points that the whistleblower was making during that 6-year period. So the department probably felt it was reactive to different points that were being made during that period. So it's not like everything was said at the beginning and it just lasted for 6 years. And I mean that sounds more dramatic than I suspect the process actually was. But the grumbling, the fact that there was a continuing set of communications should have alerted to the department to take more action. We do think that. It never quite took enough action to get ahead of the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I only reason because it's funny that government ministers spend their entire time telling us how anxious they are to deal with fraud and error, and yet here's the department apparently not seeing it as that high a priority. That's why I raise it. Anyway, let me ask you about something slightly different. The department seems to have a rather rigid debt recovery policy, and I read somewhere that if a person is on benefit, it could take 34 years to repay the overpayment in carers allowance. Do you think there is an argument for having a proper evaluation of the debt recovery policy, and particularly its impact on the carer and the disabled person?
Yes, I do.
And have you recommended that's what should happen?
Well, we didn't recommend it in this report because one, it's sorry to be boring about it, but this is an investigation
Sure.
we've done. But also because we think that is in the policy area of saying, are we going to take a different view of how we pursue debt? That's something the department needs to think about. But my remarks at the beginning about taking a view on an administrative basis, I think were designed to address that. What I said to you at the very beginning is designed to address that.
I mean, am I being unreasonable if I say that it would appear the department has a slightly lackadaisical attitude to tracking fraud and error, but it certainly has quite a robust attitude to taking money back, irrespective of the consequences for the individual, once it's clear that there's been a problem?
I think that's a bit tough, if I'm honest with you. I mean, and the reason you might say, well, why am I being uncharacteristically nice to the department? and it's
far
only,
be it from me to say
it's
that.
only for this reason, and forgive me, I'm being frank, okay, but the reason is because I'd rather focus on the actual issue that might make a difference rather than simply, take a shot at the department of it. So, I think the department, fraud and error in the round, this is a relatively small benefit in the scheme of things.
Yes.
Fraud and error in the round is an enormous set of numbers, and they're not expected to come down very much as universal credit is being implemented. So there's some really big issues there. The department knows they're big issues. They're not easy. We don't think they're easy. We're doing another study on fraud and error. So we do. I don't think either we or the department think this is a minor issue. We know it's really important. As far as enforcement of debt is concerned, I suspect the department is struggling with the fact that they don't want to create a precedent about forgiving debt, which might be applied across the system. And that's why, in my not terribly subtle way, I'm trying to say, why don't you use some of the discretionary provisions you've got to actually do something that don't require you to make a decision that might have very much more significant financial consequences across the whole system. And I'm sorry if I haven't put that, but I'm trying to be as clear as I can.
Yeah, no,
that's where I'm trying to go with my answers to you.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. But you think it would be useful, certainly for this carers allowance, to have some evaluation of the impact of the recovery?
No, I do.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Your investigation found that the DWP haven't conducted any recent evaluation of the debt recovery policies. Number 6, sorry. It didn't seem. Have we I mean, I was interested in how hardship affects individuals. I've got a constituent at the moment who's being told she's got an overpayment of carers allowance, and because she's got fluctuating earnings, she's been told that she didn't specifically declare that she had fluctuating earnings and use those words. Although she also declared that she had childcare payments, she wasn't asked for the amount and so didn't give them. She's therefore being told that she can't claim those childcare payments, and they're going back over a period of time to claim the weeks in which her payments took her over the earnings threshold. I mean, is that a fair way to be treating individuals?
It does sound a little bit Alice in Wonderland, the whole thing, doesn't it? You listen to it and think, well, people are on the phone trying to work out doing quite complicated perms things in order to try and comply with these rules. It does sound like an odd way for people, a way of doing things that make it very easy for things to go wrong. I suspect that's the problem, or for people to make mistakes, or just not have time to sit on the phone trying to get in touch and have these conversations. I think so. That's why I'm kind of urging more understanding of the circumstances of people and the difficulty of complying, even, assuming they want to comply, the difficulty of complying, and also I think of being a little bit more relaxed about in collection and possibly also enforcement.
If I may as well.
Yes, I was quite interested in your response that as a chartered accountant you understood from the carers allowance letter to claimants exactly what they were supposed to be doing and how the rules operated. As a tax accountant, I must say that I didn't understand it as clearly, particularly the payments, the allowances that can be deducted, which aren't made clear either there.
Well,
or
let me be
UK.
very specific. As a chartered accountant, I can understand paragraph 2 of the letter that says you can earn up to, and we had an old one, so it's the old limit, £116 each week with work you do for an employer or as self-employment after taking off certain expenses before your carer's allowance is affected. That's a very clear statement. The clause that you refer to is after taking off certain expenses. I could find nothing on the internet or in the official forms or guides that explains what those expenses are. I've looked at the manual for benefit advisors and how that's given, and I would say that is not clear. Clear. It is something you need specialist training in order to understand what those are, and that's why you're left in the position that I kind of said before. I think if you're in any doubt, you have to end up phoning up. I thought it was really interesting report, slightly different topic, but on universal credit, by Child Poverty Action Group about the information available to claimants on their electronic claims. And I think some of the same principles apply here about, is it made obvious to you as a claimant which elements in your, when you're given a statement, you have been found to be eligible for and ones you have not, so that, for example, is it obvious to you that your childcare has not been taken into account? No, it's not, because it doesn't say, by the way, we've not taken it into account. And I think some of those principles would be incredibly helpful in the way that the department communicates, and I hope it's something that they'll be listening to and taking forward.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just on that paragraph as well, it doesn't explicitly say, it says your carer's allowance will be affected. It doesn't say you will lose it the moment you earn a penny over the earnings threshold. It could certainly be clearer, would you agree?
But you have a point that it does not say that it will be stopped.
I agree.
Yeah, as the vast majority of benefits are paid on a taper rate. So, I mean, you mentioned universal credit, and obviously fraud and error levels are up to their highest under universal credit, about 8.6% at the moment. Are there any lessons from dealing with carers allowance that could be applied across to universal credit?
Yeah, Josh.
Sure. I'm sure there are. That's why we're going to do another study looking exactly at that in depth.
Excellent.
And trying to work it out. The key things I would take away here are about the kind of that iterative process of working out where you deploy your resources, how do you improve controls, about taking action as early as possible, certainly in the communication bit we've just talked about. I'm sure there's lots. That is the general approach the department's taking. What I'm interested in finding out in a new study is how well are they doing that, and is there anything we can observe at a very granular level, because this is not a big... it's not a big fight at a big top-level issue. This is about the granularity of administration and whether or not it's being done control by control. It's tricky, difficult stuff.
And tricky, difficult stuff takes a lot of qualified, experienced staff to do that. In your view, is the department's spending package for the next year or so going into this on administration capable of administering that granular approach and the individual approach to hardship, which you've set out, is necessary in order to avoid it.
Well, I think the department will appreciate support of the committee as they approach spending review, with any advice you can give them on making sure they're adequately resourced in this area. I mean, you know, of course they could have more resource. On the other hand, I'm sure what the Treasury will say is a big department. They've got a significant amount of resource. There's a combination of more resource and being better organised, and the two things need to work together. Understanding the problems more clearly, being better organised. There's still challenges there, as well as having. It's not just simply a question of having more resource.
Okay, thank you.
I think when this committee looked at fraud and error a few years ago, I think the Public Accounts Committee did a session on it as well. One of the recommendations was that they should set targets for each different benefit so they could check whether they're complying with them, whether there's any issues cropping up. I mean, I was a bit surprised to read in your report, I think it's around figure 7, that the estimates for fraud and error in carers allowance were actually based on a study done in 1996, 1997. I mean, it doesn't suggest they really have a great handle on what the problems might be, because I suspect there's one or two more people claiming carers allowance now than there were in 1996, 97, isn't it?
I'd like to say that it's doubled in the last 10 years. Yes, so we've been saying for a long time that they ought to measure it. The department has now committed to measure it next year. That will be a one-off exercise. The problem if you don't measure it is that they've doubled the number that they are detecting overpayments in the last year, and they don't know if that is a good thing or a bad thing. It's probably a good thing because, as we said in the report, that there are reasons why they're detecting more, but it could just be that the underlying prevailing rate of fraud and error has ballooned, and we do not know. So that is why you need to measure it. And if you're going to do that iterative process of improving and identifying what works and what doesn't work, then you need to measure it. The difficult and challenging they've got is measuring it is really expensive and really time consuming because it requires lots of people going through each claim, a sample of claims, and checking that it's been correct, and contacting the claimant and going through, essentially auditing the claimant's lives to check that it is that it's done. So it's a big exercise, but it is one that we have said is worthwhile for carers allowance.
Presumably, I think those historic measures assume that the rate of claimant error was 1% and the rate of fraud was 4 times that at 3.9. I mean, that's, from all the evidence I've had anecdotally, you would think that error would be a much higher proportion than actually people setting out to deliberately defraud the system. I mean, would you agree that those levels just look a bit out of line with what you've seen from the evidence?
I think it would be strange if the same rates for 20 years ago are accurate. We were trying to work out, is there a view as to what is the actual rate of fraud? And all we can basically say, because fraud is a difficult thing and the burden of proof is quite high, when you actually look at the detected levels, we get to that 10%. Just under 10% are actually found to either be fraudulent or a civil penalty is applied. There must be a range within there where there is, there may well have been an intention, but not to a burden of proof. You're right, that these statistics would suggest that the majority is fraud, and that's not the pattern of behaviour that we're seeing from the department and its prosecution policy. I wait with bated breath the new stats in 2020.
No doubt we'll all be here again. Well, not all of us, Amyas, because it's probably your
sadly
appearance.
Sadly not me.
Depending on what you do afterwards, we never know where you might turn up. But I mean, do you have any, perhaps, final reflections on the department or this field that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I think the first... All right, very, very quickly, I'll say just... First of all, this is not easy stuff, and I'm not... we're talking about mass application for people who are mostly in difficult circumstances, and where the rules are... People seem to generate quite complex rules, which makes it, for somebody who's you think in sort of modern systems terms, whenever you have complex rules, making them work through, what would be really great is if we had a live information environment, we actually knew what was going on. We weren't doing a special measurement exercise every year. We actually knew pretty much what the state was. That would require an approach to rule making on benefits and allowances, which was much less detailed and picky than what we've got. So we have to live with the fact that it's not going to be like that. This is always going to be, for the foreseeable future, unless there's a big change in philosophy, a quite complex and difficult area. And I'm not sure that universal credit has made it that much simpler on what we've seen so far. The one point I would make to the department is, I think the department carries a heavy burden and it's constantly being challenged and it gets a lot of criticism. But this is a point we made in our last report on universal credit, and I think it's worth repeating now. Those pressures, which I understand and am sympathetic to, can lead to the department becoming not very receptive to signals from either user groups or charities or others who might be who are often heard to have a critical voice. But you can't let things resolve themselves into an us and them environment. And if you find that the teams who are running things in the department develop a defensive attitude, don't want to listen, or if they're getting feedback that doesn't kind of fit with their view of things, they're very slow to take it on board. We might be looking at some examples of that in this report. I think, however hard it is, you want team spirit, you want team loyalty, but on the other hand, people need to keep on listening to the reality out there. And I think that's hard for all of the great departments, but particularly those where they have long-running, tough programs to run like this one. And therefore, that is something. It's not to say something I'm not trying to say anything very negative about the department, but I think this idea of groupthink and not being that receptive is something, and I believe that the accounting officer understands this and shares the need to keep very open and listening. But it hasn't always been the case, and in recent history I don't think it's always been the case. So that's what I would leave you with. If the committee keeps pushing for that, a receptive attitude, notwithstanding the difficulty of running the system, still stay receptive and sympathetic to the circumstances of the people you're dealing with, I think that's actually not just a sort of pious comment. It really makes a difference to how well the system works and whether it produces satisfactory results.
Okay, that's a very helpful message for us, Amyas. We're very grateful for all the help and support your team have given us and the great work you do, which really helps and informs our work. We wish you all the best for your future endeavours. Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
To the second part of our session. Peter, could you introduce yourself and your team for the record, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm Peter Schofield, I'm the Permanent Secretary at DWP. I'm joined by Emma Haddad, who's the Director General for Service Excellence in DWP, and by Laura Squire, who's the Deputy Director for Fraud and Error.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you've heard the previous session, you've seen the report. I mean, I think it seems pretty clear that you're now detecting overpayments that you probably could and should have detected much earlier. I mean, why didn't you do the job properly all along and stop this building up to the level it has and putting people in arrears that they didn't really need to have been got into?
Well, no, thank you. I just wanted to say I really welcome the review that's being done. I welcome the report by the National Audit Office. This is an area that we wanted to look into. As this committee knows, I commissioned my own review from our own internal audit, which was produced over the course of the last few months and the NEO had access to. And I also want to just also support Amyas's last words there in terms of the sort of culture that we need to develop as a department. I want us to be a department which is listening, which is open and engaging, and particularly in terms of how to engage with outside partners and those who support groups to whom we serve, including carers. I've had a great opportunity to spend a bit of time last week with Carers UK in preparing for this hearing. So in terms of your question, I think this is the report identifies a lot of challenges here which go back to the fact that we've seen volumes of people on carers allowance increasing over the last 10 years, doubling pretty much over that period of time, and particular resourcing constraints that we faced over the period from around 2014 onwards, and that's flagged up in the report. At the same time, we've had access to data matching mechanisms which over a period of time have got better, but in the past were not very accurate at all. So I think you see in the report accuracy rates on data matching of the old paper-based so-called RD23 system of something like 6 to 8%. And I think the challenge for us has been how much resource to put into what can sometimes feel like chasing a needle through the proverbial haystack, when at the same time we've got pressures to drive down our backlogs in terms of processing the work. So the priority, I think, which you can see in the charts through 2017, was actually getting new claims processed. We saw a backlog of new claims reaching a peak. And of course what we really want to do is make sure those people who are entitled to carers allowance who make a claim get it, and we sort that out. We saw that falling away. We then saw the opportunity to tackle both the matching through new technology coming through, which is more accurate, and also the opportunity to address the backlogs on changes of circumstance, which has also reached a peak towards the end of last year, which we've now got back down to the level we'd want it to be at. So we've learnt a lot in this process, and there's a lot for us to work on the basis of this report.
I mean, you said you were keen and committed to doing this, but I mean, the first whistleblowing on this was 9 years ago. It took quite a long time for your department to really get a handle on this, didn't it? I mean, is that really an acceptable level of performance? It took so many rounds of whistleblowing and probably a select committee session before you really got moving on this.
Well, I don't think it's fair that we didn't get moving on it before that. As Joshua said just now, we have a process of whistleblowing procedures which are looked at by outside bodies such as the Civil Service Commission, and a whistleblower would take their points up through the management chain. As the report sets out, in 2016 the whistleblower raised this with my predecessor. You then saw action being taken in terms of internal audit being put in to have a look at this. You saw action in the way of described in terms of resourcing to address some of the backlogs on new claims, and then over a period of time we've seen other backlogs being addressed. But do I think we need to respond more quickly to some of this? Yes, I think we can. I think one of the big challenges of resourcing a department like ours is that hopefully if in the future backlogs build up, it then takes an awful lot of effort to turn them round, because a backlog creates its own work quite naturally. Customers are phoning up and chasing their claim, and that's additional work to address. The right thing to do is to be able to spot the pressures building before they emerge. And I think there were opportunities to have done that in the case of carers allowance earlier on, because of course there is a link, as the report says, between claims on PIP and claims on carers allowance. And when we saw the build-up in claims on PIP, we should have then said there's obviously going to be a build-up of work on carers allowance, and we should have got ahead of the curve. So a lot of the points that Amyas was saying just a moment ago around being ahead of the curve, these are lessons I feel we are learning, but it's really good to have this challenge to know how far we've got to go on this.
You slightly glossed over the fact it was 6 years from the first whistleblowing before anything really happened, didn't you? I mean, I think
you were seeing action through the management chain, But the work that we've been doing in terms of reviewing what happened in the light of the whistleblowers investigation, you saw the NAO's review started in 2016, looking back to that point. And I've also looked at internal audit that was commissioned in the light of that and other data that we had coming in over the last 2-3 years.
See, claimants do have a right to expect the department to enforce these rules, don't they? I mean, I accept that claimants have a duty to keep information up to date when they have change of circumstances, but I think we all have a right to expect that you administer these things competently and you don't lead people into trouble by not checking the information that you realistically have. I mean, do you apologise to all those claimants who have now got pretty large overpayments in some cases and are suffering losses of income for the fact that at least a proportion of that situation therein is down to the fact that you didn't have the processes in place to check this situation out a long time before you do now have them?
Well, look, I mean, the most important thing is to create the environment in which claimants are able to report changes of circumstance to us. And there's some challenge in the report, quite rightly, about the quality of communication. Like Joshua and Amyas, I've also been looking at those letters. Appendix 2 is the one to look at. At one level, it's clear. But sitting down with Carers UK, looking at this, there's no doubt that we could try and improve some of that. I mean, the key point for carers is if there is any, and this is there, it's in the letter, some of this is in page 3 and page 4 rather than page 1, but it is there. The key thing is if there is any change of circumstance, just let us know, and we need to and we have made it as straightforward as we can for people to let us know. They can let us know online, they can phone, they can write to us. Once you've done that, then it is no longer, a risk of claimant error. Then it is down to us to address that, and that's the key point. And for me, the big focus. Remember our work around data matching and the like. That's part of a wider strategy to clamp down on levels of both overpayment and underpayment, and they will always target that aspect of data that points to where the biggest risk of over and underpayment is. The real focus for claimants is just making it easy for them to understand their responsibility to let us know and to make it easy for them to report a change of circumstance.
But do you apologise for the department's role in the fact that there are now many thousands of people who are suffering some level of hardship because you just didn't have it, because you weren't on top of this for as long as you ought to have been?
I think I'm pushing back on the point about hardship only in the context of what the report says around the hardship regime that we work, in the sense that what we're trying to do through recovery, if it's a genuine mistake, we ask for the money back that was the overpayment. But as part of that process, and I've sat with agents in our debt management offices as they've done this, it is a genuine conversation about how much people can afford to pay back. And that tends to be, in my experience anyway, tends to be led by the claimant saying, this is what I can afford. And I think it was a challenge from Mr. McCabe earlier to the NAO, saying it looked like a very rigid approach to repayment. I don't think it is. I think it's the opposite, because what we're trying to do is giving people as much time as they need to pay it back. And in one case, you've got the 34 years. That is because we're giving people a very long time to pay back. So that's how
a very large amount of money, isn't it? It would be far better for them if you discovered that.
In that context, there was a large amount
of
overpayment in that context. I accept that, yeah.
But you're still not keen to apologise for your role in allowing this level of arrears to build up. I mean, it would clearly be a better system if your data matching alerts had been investigated and the people who weren't entitled had had their claims stopped much earlier rather than in 2018. It's
really easy to put ourselves back into the feet of people back then, but the challenge you've got, it goes back to the accuracy of those paper-based matching methods. They were between 6 and 8% according to the report. And then you've got a choice, and you heard a little bit about that exemplified by the NAO a bit earlier. Leadership of DWP always have a choice about where we put our resource. And if you put your resource onto, and we have finite resource, and this committee knows about the expenditure pressures that we're under. If you put finite resource on chasing those 6 to 8% possible alerts, rather than addressing, paying people's new claims, processing changes of circumstance, chasing after the very, very biggest risks of fraud and organised crime, then you may have got the priorities wrong. Which is why I don't think, there is more opportunity now with the new technology under VEPS that the report describes, where we can be as daily alerts, we can be real time on this, we can actually prevent overpayments in some cases before they happen. We didn't have that technology before. When you've got better technology, it means it's worthwhile putting resource onto that, because it's actually going to be a more effective use of resource. Where you don't have an effective technology, which was the case with the paper-based methods, I think it is questionable as to whether putting a lot more resource on that and taking it off other really important aspects of what the department does would have been the right choice.
Okay. Thank you. There's a few things from that. On the clarity for claimants to declare change of circumstances, I was promised by the Minister last November in the Westminster Hall debate that the communication to claimants around carers allowance would be clarified, because if they're told to declare a change of circumstances, but if you're paid £125 instead of £124, people don't see it as a change of circumstances. It's simply that they did another 10 minutes of work, so that there isn't clarity around that. Do you think that letter should have been clarified before it went out this April?
Well, look, as I say, we are doing work with Carers UK, and we're kicking that off. We have kicked that off, and we're doing work on that. It's
6 months since I was promised it.
So bringing you into how difficult this is to do, the letter is generated by a very, very old computer system. And making changes is difficult. It's not impossible, it is difficult, which is why we're working to do two things. One is, what can we do within the parameters of the existing system to improve the letter? And also, what can we do, what are we doing in terms of upgrading the computer system, which we'll have much more progress on over the course of the next 12 months. The key challenge, Ms. George, I go back to it, and this is what the letter does say. If there is any change, if you're being paid any more, effectively, then you must let us know. That is there on page 3 of the letter. So it has clarity. I want to make it more clear. Well,
I don't think that's a great excuse. Back to the whistleblower issue, I'm afraid the experience that we've highlighted would not particularly feel enabling of anybody within the department who was concerned about how processes were being managed to actually raise their concerns. If it takes this long and that amount of concern, most people would leave a job that they were frustrated with in that amount of time. What are you going to do to make sure that whistleblowers are A, listened to, and B, protected when they raise concerns going forward? Because I think this exercise has shown that they're very much needed.
Well, I think it points to a wider point, if I might say as well, which is how do we make sure that the feedback, the opportunity for colleagues all across DWP to raise concerns, and not just concerns, suggestions, improvements. It's part of a wider culture here. How can we make that the culture in DWP so we can get better at what we do? And I've seen, and it's not, and there's something about the whistleblowing regime which I'm confident in, but I think we need to do more and to build on a culture where we listen to each other, and that's part of what we do. And there are ways that we do this. Some of our new systems enable us, at every point in the system, a colleague can say, a point comes up saying, what do you think we could do better on this system? And colleagues then feedback, and I see those changes being made. Sometimes in some of these systems on a fortnightly basis. And I go out, I spend a day or so a week each week out and about talking to colleagues all across the country, and it is very informal. Tell the Permanent Secretary what you want to tell the Permanent Secretary about what's going on. So there's part of a culture that we are changing to make this. There's a whistleblowing process, that's a formal process, fine, and it's important, but I want this to go beyond that in terms of the overall culture of the department and how we work.
Okay, so the whistleblowing process going forward should not involve a whistleblower having to come to this committee to see their concerns dealt with.
Well,
Will they be dealt with and that person protected?
Absolutely, no, and I mean, I think I would argue that the whistleblowers' concerns were already being dealt with before that, and you've seen some of that in the timeline in the NAO report. But absolutely, I would rather people didn't even feel they needed to go through the whistleblowing process anyway, because I want the culture to be one in which we feel we can share our views, and that leaders all across DWP are open and accessible, and it's safe for everyone to challenge. That's exactly the culture I'm seeking to create.
Okay, we would hope so going forward, but I'm afraid some of the Twitter accounts from staff, anonymous staff in DWP, don't lead us to believe that that's actually the case.
Yeah, I mean, I might have missed this, Peter, and forgive me if I have, but I mean, people will be watching this, will be asking this question is, what is the department's policy on debt collection? I mean, what's the time frame for informing someone? What time are they allowed to repay? What's the follow-up procedure? Or is it just the same that the debt collection policy is the same for every benefit? Could you maybe just enlighten the committee on that? I think
Laura might want to come in on this as well. I mean, first of all, the most important thing is if you've had a change of circumstance, let us know. And then it becomes an official error rather than, if we don't do anything about it, rather than a claimant error and there's nothing to worry about. But if we've overpaid, and it's in the category of an overpayment where we need to recover, then the contact happens between our debt management unit and the claimant. And the conversation you saw in the report, there are limits, upper limits on what we can deduct from benefits. But we have an open conversation with the claimant in terms of their personal circumstances. Some people are in a situation, often people obviously in work or who've come off benefits, are in a position in which they just want to pay it off in one go. Fine. Some people will pay it off out of their benefits and are willing to do it at the standard, at the limits that you saw in the report. But also, if people say, look, I cannot afford that, and talk to us around their expenditure and their income, then we will talk about what they can afford, and we will set this at a level that they can afford to pay. And obviously that's when we're talking about genuine, I mean, obviously then if it's a case of fraud, and I'm not going there, but there is a whole different set of collection approaches. But that is very much how we seek to work in debt management. And that is why you see in the report a whole series of different claimant rates.
Who decides on the approach then, Peter?
Who decides on
who decides on the approach? Because obviously you've indicated to the committee different things happen to different people because of different circumstances, different conversations. So who makes the decision as to what approach is appropriate then?
Well, the decision is made by debt management, by the agent. But it is led, in all the conversations I've listened to, it's led by the claimant saying this is what I can afford. And I've never heard, but it may be, but I've never heard a situation where the claimant has said, well, I can only afford this, and the person has said, well, no, I'm going to push it at this level. I mean, Laura, I don't know whether you want to
Yes, I think the only thing I'd add to that is it isn't in our interests to set up a repayment plan that won't last. We need to look for sustainable ones, so there wouldn't be any point in us doing what Peter's just said of actually saying, well, if you can't afford this, we'll push you for a higher amount, because all that would happen then is the repayment plan would break down. So we do, and our agents work with guidance, and they are looking for a sustainable repayment plan that will last. Having said that, if there is another financial shock changes, someone can come back to us again, and we can readjust that if that first payment.
So who decides, Laura, then? Who would make the decision to decide whether an overpayment should be written off or part of it's written off? Who would make that decision?
So that again,
for people who are watching this, I think people who are watching this would like to know this.
So we would have specialist decision makers on that. There are some very clear reasons why we can write up, for example, if it's below the economical limit. But there are conversations that happen if somebody says that they are in hardship or difficulty, or the repayments are really having a detrimental effect on their health or the health of the family. That is within our guidance that people are empowered to consider that in the circumstances.
Thank you.
Yeah, you were talking about a change of culture, and I just wondered if you, sort of the people at the top of the organisation, do ever meet groups of carers or people who are really, directly, there's a lot of people in between you, for example, and the carers themselves, the claimants themselves. Do you ever have round tables or meetings where you go to meet them and discuss their personal lives? Because one thing that if I was sitting here watching you making excuses when Ruth asks that it's months and months since she asked for a particular report or some clarification on something, yet somebody sitting at home with an incredibly difficult and stressful life is punished for not having the resources that your department can't seem to use to get us answers within months. There's someone who might have done an hour's extra work. So I just wonder if, with all the resources at your command, if you can't meet your deadlines and targets, do you have any concept how it is that somebody who may be looking after someone with a severe disability, trying to juggle childcare and work, feels when they are punished for not getting something to you within a few days or weeks? Because that seems to be a huge disconnect.
So I think you make a lot of good points here around what it's like to lead an organisation like this. And it's a priority for me. And this was a challenge, actually, that the Public Accounts Committee put to me in one of my early hearings soon after I became Permanent Secretary, was how do you get out and about and hear the voice of partners and claimants and customers of DWP? So what I try and do, and I can't do it every week, but what I try and do each week is get out and about and be in a part of the country where I can meet partners from that area, and sometimes through the partners then get introduced to claimants, people who are facing complex needs, some of the most vulnerable people that we support, and hearing it from them. And that takes me into a number of different places. It's an amazing privilege to be able to be invited into people's lives sometimes and see some of that, and seeing what we do from the point of view of the customer. So I think I'd give you one example of that. I had, I just remember, because it was also a Wednesday, and I'd spent the morning in the Palace of Westminster on various meetings in this grand place. And then I got on a tube train down to South Wimbledon and went to a Salvation Army hall where we have a DWP outreach worker there in a homeless drop-in centre. And I sat down with people who were trying to claim universal credit and listening to the challenges of claiming universal credit when you don't have an address. And what I learned from that is what we can do differently and how we can change that.
So that
I think
did
part of
inform your policy making decisions.
So part of it is, I just think it is important. I'm sorry, I'd just give that as one example. I think it is important for someone in my position to, and it is a busy role, and a lot of what I do keeps me in Westminster, Whitehall, for understandable reasons. But I think it is incumbent in me in my role to spend some time when I can out and about, and it'll always be clearly a snapshot. Ultimately, there are 20 million people who, one way or another, receive some support from DWP. So it's always going to be a snapshot. But it's really important, and that's a culture that I'm trying to set. So when I take directors away, so that's the top 50 leaders in the department, which includes quite a number of directors who are corporate centre people, finance, which is my background before coming into this role, amongst other places. I'd say, right, for the morning, I'm going to send you out to a frontline office somewhere, and you can experience some of the front line of what we do. And it goes back, I thought, to Amyas's really wise points around this being an organisation that sees what we do from the point of view of the people that we serve. That hasn't answered your specific question about carers. And so, my first meeting with carers, personally, my first meeting with Carers UK was last week, but colleagues are interacting with Carers UK on a regular basis. Okay. And part of the work we do going forward on communication has got to be informed by Carers UK and others who represent the people who we're trying to inform and trying to engage with, so that they can give us the information that they need to give us so we can pay them right first time.
Okay, thank you.
Steve?
I just wanted to check, Chair, that I had understood the answer to the question about recovery. Am I right in thinking that where you identify an overpayment, you notify the person, they are then entitled, or a representative trying to help them is entitled to negotiate the level of repayments, the period of repayments with you, and then that's passed to a debt recovery agency? Is that how it works?
No, we don't work. We don't do an awful lot with debt recovery.
Well, who are the
agencies.
agents in this case?
So it depends. Yeah, so it's all within DWP College, so it does depend on how the debt's being recovered. So if we take the carer's allowance debts, for example, there are probably about half of those where people are no longer on any benefit whatsoever. So in those circumstances, we wouldn't be doing deductions from benefits. We would either ask them first for a voluntary arrangement, but that is a conversation, that would suit them. If they have earnings, then we can do a direct attachment to their earnings, but again, that comes after a conversation. So that's how we would do that. That's all DWP that would do that. There are some cases that go to debt recovery agencies, but generally, because we can use direct attachments to earnings, we don't need to. For those,
and is it possible to, you may not be able to tell me this now, but is it possible to say what proportion of recovery is dealt with through attachment of earnings and debt recovery agencies, and what proportion is dealt with by some other method?
Yes, we've got that data. So
we write to you on that.
Yes.
Okay, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Schofield, you uttered that entirely immortal phrase, "Don't worry, it'll all be fine, we've got a new IT system coming along." Maybe not in quite those words. I mean, how confident are you that your VEP system will really fix this problem?
Well, the VEP system is part of the solution. As I say, the starting point is having a relationship with claimants such that they know and can easily let us know of changes of circumstance, because that's going to be the best way of addressing this. The VEP system, we've rolled it out, carer's allowance is one of the first benefits we've rolled it out on, but we have already rolled it out on pension credit, and we're seeing the success rate around 50%. So where there's an alert, around 50% of the time it is taking us into the right place. So that it means we can use our resources, really quite effectively. And I'm hoping that in carer's allowance we get to that point as well. I mean, the only thing I would say, and it is mentioned in the report around the limit to automation, the thing about carer's allowance, that earnings threshold is a net figure that you look at after you've deducted all various things that are mentioned in the report. So you can't make a direct match to what the HMRC real-time earnings information is telling us and whether someone is above the earnings threshold. We might get an RTI feed that says someone is above the threshold in earnings, but then that triggers a conversation with the claimant. You say, well, have you got any relevant deductions? And I know from Carers UK, many of these, the ability to deduct is something that is really valued. I mean, the ability to cover alternative care costs through a deduction is really valued by carers. So those deductions are important, but it just means that automation is not a direct one. You have to have a conversation about people's deductions as part of the decision.
Okay. And are you still confident of 136 million of savings from VEPs by reducing carers' allowance fraud and error? Is that what you're expecting by 2025?
Yes, it is. But we keep this under review,
okay.
And I imagine the NEO will look at this very carefully in the review that Amyas mentioned.
How many alerts do you think VEPs would give you to investigate or at least consider on carers' allowance a year?
Well, I mean, that depends really on how it works, but I mean, we're anticipating, I don't see why we shouldn't get as successful a rate as of success rate as we're getting on pensions credit. Okay, I mean, the report itself has a table, doesn't it, with the number of
yes,
alerts, doesn't it?
3.18 suggests that you might. I think originally you were expecting 380,000 alerts, but you've got that down to 75,000. But that's still quite a lot.
I was thinking about, Mr. Chair, I was looking at figure 10, which breaks it down between the different weighs in. So on vets, which is the bottom one there, average monthly matches flagged 6,250, number of flag matches investigated per month 2,000, and there's no backlog, I think that's saying, isn't it?
But that still assumes that each of your 33 full-time staff could investigate about 200 cases a month each. I mean, that's quite a lot, isn't it? That's 10 a day.
Yeah, but if it's a much more effective system and it's coming up with kind of daily alerts, then, you know, you should be... I mean, I know that the NAO have made that comparison back to what's been done in the past, but I think with a new technology which is more accurate, then I don't see why we shouldn't get that. But we'll obviously keep that under review.
And what about all the historic stuff that presumably people who were in the system before but are not currently claiming won't be in your VEPS alerts, won't trigger them? Are you just going to forget about the history and not look back at those that are not now claiming, or will there be some other process where you keep trawling back and try and find historic money to get back?
Well, no, because there's a sort of limit to whether that's a sensible thing to do with resources, let alone everything else. So we are looking, and the report talks about how we're going back and taking a sample just to see whether these are checks that could otherwise be left until there's a VEPS alert. We're basically taking a risk-based approach here. We'd focus on the ones where there's more likely to be a larger amount of overpayment that we need to address.
What are you going to do for those 30% of people in receipt of carers allowance if you can't use VEPS on? Because I think you haven't got things like their date of birth, so you can't match them up. I mean, they're going to get off scot-free. You're going to try and find a way of dealing with them.
Well, of course, we've got the other matching arrangements available for them, but our plan is to try and address these software issues as quickly as we can, so we can roll this out more broadly.
Okay, the last one from me. Emma, we've not heard from you yet, so we might feel that you're missing out. I think you have one of those optimistic job titles of Director General Service Excellence Group. So what does service excellence look like then for people who are claiming carers allowance?
Yeah, thank you. And it is a very new job title and a very new job, and it's part of our reorganisation within DWP, so that we do actually make sure we properly focus always from wherever anybody's sitting, corporate centre colleagues, as Peter said, as well as our frontline staff, on the customer outcomes and what we're trying to achieve, the kind of service we're trying to deliver. In my new role, one of the first things I've done is set up a new board. It's called the Service Transformation Board, and we took carers allowance as our pretty much our first example, and said, well, it's got a few issues. It's been untouched and unloved in some ways for quite some years in terms of technology. The policy hasn't changed dramatically over the years. We've got some clunky processes that could be much more efficient. We've got a huge amount of very experienced and dedicated staff, but we're not necessarily giving them everything to do their job the most efficiently. So what can we do by joining up across the department to really look at the way that we operate this product and give the customer the best experience? So going back to the communications issue, looking at our letters, but also looking at how do we use SMS texting. Hardly at all at the moment. We're trialling one. I think we could do a lot more there, not just rely on hard copy letters. Looking at gov.uk.
So you'll text carers and say, have your circumstances changed?
Well, we might. At the moment,
did you earn more than 100?
At the moment, we're trialling it with, we've received your claim, you will receive your first payment on, so at least they get that information and don't have to call us and check and take the time to call. But it may well lead to have your circumstances change. I think that would actually be a good way of reminding people that you need to let us know so you don't build up overpayments. So that's in its early stages. But in general, automation is another one, that we haven't introduced in carers at all. So are there ways to automate some of the processes that our staff currently have to do, which are very manual and inefficient, and actually free up them to do the work where we need human judgment to take the best sensible decisions with our claimants.
But do you think, wouldn't this be far better if we just had a nice taper on this benefit? I mean, wouldn't that be one of the service excellences that would make this a whole lot easier?
Well, operationally, a taper is pretty tricky to administer, and my policy colleagues won't thank me for saying, yes, we should introduce one tomorrow.
So with a trial.
There's an interesting thing about the taper it's worth the committee being aware of, because I mean, if you've got someone who's on low income on carer's allowance, they'll also, probably, depending on their household circumstances, they'll also probably be on universal credit. And the way the interaction between carer's allowance and universal credit works is that we deduct pound for pound the carer's allowance amount from their universal credit. So in that situation, if someone like that then went over the earnings threshold, there's a cliff edge, they lose their carer's allowance, but having lost their carer's allowance, they get reinstated the amount back into their universal credit. And then if they earn additional amounts, then the taper in universal credit works in the normal way, which is why I think it's quite important for us. And there was a challenge here about us understanding the circumstances and I mean, I guess more in the context of repayment, but the incentives on people to work in the context of carers allowance. I think we need to do some research a bit more on how that cliff edge plays out in relation to other benefits. Because certainly if someone is on universal credit, you lose carers allowance, but you immediately get the UC uplift at the same time. But it's not, I mean, there will be people who, because of household circumstances, maybe their partner is earning a significant amounts of money, they're not eligible for universal credit, in which case the cliff edge does apply. But if you are on universal credit as well, then it doesn't play out in the way I think the committee had understood.
Could I just ask how that works in practice? I mean, what's the average amount of time that it takes for a carer's allowance case over the threshold to be picked up? I mean, the average amounts of overpayments here are around 6 months, aren't they?
So in a situation where, well, I'm in a situation where, yes.
Because that is not going to interact well with universal credit, because you won't end up getting it back because it will all presumably come in 1 month.
Well, the key thing, at the end of the day, the key thing. Well, no, I don't think I'd say that. but the key thing is, isn't it, that it goes back to what I was saying about carers letting us know about changes of circumstance. What I'm saying is that if there is a change of circumstance that means that a carer is earning more than the earnings threshold, then they don't immediately lose everything in that context, because they would then receive an uplift in their universal credit to take account of the fact that we're no longer deducting carers allowance pound for pound out of their universal credit. In practice, where that happens, it is, I think, more automated already, because this already happens in the case of income support. So if you're not on universal credit because you're on the legacy system, then you'd be on income support and carers allowance. In that case, if you lose your carers allowance, as I understand it, I think there's a fairly automated process of reinstating income support. We haven't yet automated that for universal credit. So for a claimant, if a claimant loses carers allowance and they're on universal credit, key thing is write in your journal straight away, I've lost carers allowance, please can you uplift my universal credit? And that then kicks off a conversation with the case manager on this.
Possibly think the department could do that. I mean, you're paying carers allowance and you're paying universal credit. Do I really need to go on my journal and tell you that the thing you've just told me, I now need to tell you again? I mean, you think your department...
Yeah, no, look, in the context of service excellence and where Emma and I want to get to, that is exactly where I want to get to. I'm just saying, right now, that is always the advice. Let us know of any change of circumstance. But I'm just saying that there isn't necessarily that cliff edge that the committee were worried about.
But if I'm on universal credit and carers allowance, and I know my UC is going up and down based on my earnings, do I not sort of have a right to think that you might know what my earnings are, and therefore you might also be calculating my carers allowance, right? Because I've got so many components of universal credit, I probably can't remember whether carers is one of those 5 components I've got on my UC.
I appreciate the point, but that goes back to the point I was making earlier about the difference in definition of net earnings for carers allowance, a benefit that was introduced many, many years ago, and that is a different definition from the definition of earning in HMRC. And the reason for that is because of these deductions, which are deductions that carers want. Yeah. So I wouldn't want to change that.
I accept that, but you're saying to me, you want money back from me for an overpayment because I haven't told you about a change of circumstances, and yet I know that for the rest of my household income every month, you know exactly what I'm earning because you calculate how much you give me based on how much I'm earning. So yeah, I'm meant to ring another part of your department and tell you how much I'm earning and check whether I'm still entitled to the first thing that affects the second. I mean, you can understand why people are a little bit confused as to whether they're complying or not in this situation, can't you?
Well, ultimately, the VEP system, which is based on exactly the same feed as universal credit, will give that alert straight away. So ultimately that is where I'd want to be. But, you know, the department in the past has been, you know, systems have been developed product by product, benefit by benefit. And over a period of time, part of what we're trying to do in the culture that we're changing, the ways of working, the organisational redesign that Emma has described, I want to get to a point where you have a single way into DWP. But I'm afraid I can't say we're there yet. Chris?
Okay, thanks. I think, again, we've probably skirted around this, Peter, but just to ask, what analysis is the department carrying out on the impact of the well-being of claimants, or claimants' well-being, from the collection of overpayments?
Oh, the point in the report. Yes. So we last seemed to do some work on this in 2014, but in the light of this report, I've asked our analysts to prepare a research plan to enable us to get into this.
Right, so that work's going to be carried out then. So is the department considering or considered writing off overpayment debts, particularly where there is evidence that the overpayment could have been caught sooner?
Well, so a number of steps to that. So we don't try and recover all of the all overpayments. In fact, there's a chart early on in the report that shows, I think it's figure 3, yeah, it shows total overpayments detected, and yet how many of those were actually passed on to debt recovery, and it's, you know, it's around about a half or even less actually in some years. And that's because the difference is obviously if it's our mistake, then we'd write that off. If it's below the level that it would be economic for us to collect, then we'd write that off. Yep. And then we've talked about the hardship, Rosie.
Pounds still, isn't it?
Yeah, so, and I was quite interested in what Amyas was saying about that. I mean, I think Amyas's way into the, you know, could we go further on this, is probably the right methodology. I'm not sure what the answer would be. I mean, his suggestion is that we need to look at the cost of, is it worthwhile from an economic point of view, chasing small amounts of overpayment. And I think we should do the work and understand that. Is £65 the right level still? The other interesting point...
Is that a promise that you will do that work?
Yes. Oh, sorry, I was not clear in my language. Yes, we'll do the work.
And by when might we
I don't know. I don't know.
have findings?
I don't know. I'll keep the committee in touch.
But is that a this year job, or is this going to be a long...
I don't know how much work it entails, he says, hedging his bets. I will obviously want to push this on as quickly as possible. The interesting point, I think, is whether the fact that the carer's allowance weekly amount has gone above £65, whether that means, and the report is suggesting that means we'll now look to recover overpayments of only 1 week. I'm not sure, and Emma may be able to correct me on this, I'm not sure that is necessarily how it would work operationally, because we pay carers allowance 1 week, a week in advance. And so by the point where someone is quite, at the earliest opportunity they've told us about a change of circumstance, they've got paid extra that week, they've already had the carers allowance, well, they've told us as quickly as they could tell us, so it's an official error, not a claimant error. But I think that's
well, just to be clear then.
Yeah.
So if the department take a view or a decision, well, we should have caught this earlier, then some of that debt or all of that debt would be written off.
No, sorry, to be clear, a claimant error, an official error, is where someone has told us about a change of circumstance, but we haven't done anything to trigger a change in that. And in that case, exactly, we would then repay. We would write that off, and that's true of quite a lot of our benefits, not just carers allowance. But my particular, I was just thinking the operational impact of someone gets a pay increase. They notice that at the end of their week they got a pay increase. They're above the threshold. But because we pay carers allowance a week in advance, they would have already received the carers allowance. So that money is in their bank account. It is an overpayment, I guess. But because they told us on the Friday, or as soon as reasonably practical, that they had an overpayment, then they've told us as soon as they can. And we wouldn't operationally seek to collect that, even though the amount would be over the £65 limit that is referred to here.
Okay. Well, turning back to the report then. There's obviously a concern that there's no recording how often or how much you have to pay out in arrears of other benefits, and particularly thinking about the severe disability premium, Peter. So is there a reason why that's the case, that there's no recording of how often or how much you have to pay out in arrears of SDP when you detect a carer's allowance overpayment?
This is a difficult one, and the NAA sort of brought that out in their oral evidence just earlier, I think. I mean, the severe disability premium is paid to the disabled person. Carer's allowance is paid to the carer. And this also linked to the point that I think you asked around the ability to net one off against the other. We don't think we're allowed to do that because we have a duty to claimants according to their kind of circumstances.
It's a joint claim in the first place. So.
Well, it's not a joint claim. The carer has to get the. I mean, I suppose the carer has to get the disabled person to sign to say they're being cared for by this person, but the formal position under the regulations is that it is the carer who's receiving the money. So it's not like universal credit where you have a household claim. It is one and the other. So it is more difficult. But the key thing for me is making it as straightforward as possible when someone is in that situation to make the link. And the NAO went to see how we do this, and they. They said they thought the system. So I don't want to put words into their mouth, so I won't. But they didn't. The report does not say that they thought there was a problem with that, and I think that matching works operationally, but we have just the formal difference between the.
Well, let's try this then, Peter. Yeah. I mean, of the 150 million that's estimated to be carers' allowance overpayments, is there an estimate of how much you'll have to pay out in arrears, or, for example, SDP or any other benefit?
No, and the report points that out. I don't know that number. I'm not sure whether we can do that number. The key thing for me, though, is in each and every circumstance where that happens, that we deal with that as quickly as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Can I just ask, are claimants informed that they may be eligible for SDP? Because certainly the case that I've been taking up with the Secretary of State with you directly, then that claimant was taken to court and has got his house up for sale and in threat of being made homeless, but is owed almost exactly the same amount in SDP as he was in carer's allowance. But he wasn't informed.
So the way the system should work, and this is part of our efforts to try and reduce, because I care as much, if not more, about reducing levels of underpayment as I do about levels of overpayment. The system the scans should pick up where someone is not claiming a benefit to which they're entitled to. And the SDP, and it's covered to some extent in the report, isn't it? But the SDP is covered by that.
But it's not happening in practice.
Well, I've written to the individual's MP yesterday with an update on the case. So probably best not to talk about that particular case. But I mean, my sense is that the NAA's report looked at this and felt that this is something that we do and is operating, but we could clearly always improve it. And I would just continue to urge the committee, if there are cases where, on any of this actually, and some, and I'm grateful, Ms George, for your correspondence, but if you want to raise any individual case with me direct, I will follow that up.
Okay.
Rosie?
Okay, we've sort of stressed aspects of this quite a lot, but I think it's really important to be clear. If under 10% of overpayments referred to debt management are found to be fraudulent, do you accept then that the rest of those overpayments are genuine, legitimate mistakes by the carer? And if so many carers are making honest mistakes, what level of responsibility for that lies within the department and its systems and communications?
Well, So the difference in terms of what we do, if it's a fraudulent claim, then there'll be a penalty, and extreme cases there'll be prosecution. In the case of a genuine mistake, what we call claimant error, then we simply ask for the money back. Though I appreciate in some cases that can be really quite difficult given the circumstances. The responsibility I think, is around the level, making the, I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier around the quality of our communications. You know, as Joshua from the NAO said, you can look at the communication and say, well, that's pretty clear. But the key thing is how this is actually landing with the people that we're serving, which is why we're working, as I say, with Carers UK, and keen for other stakeholders who've got an interest to come forward and help us get this right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. You said earlier that that VEPs going back 12 months, it probably wasn't worthwhile to go back on cases that are older than that. And that's good news for people who've got historic cases who haven't been picked up yet. But do you not think that people whose cases were not looked at for quite a long period of time, albeit not under your direction, but then had them picked up and are going back a long time with serious overpayments, would not feel rather aggrieved that they're being sought for collection, whereas people on an ongoing basis are not?
Well, I think the point is we think that VEPs will pick up more accurately probably the same cases that might have shown up in earlier data, but is more like the needle in the proverbial haystack. So we think we're going to be picking... The reason for... and the table we referred to earlier kind of looks into this, doesn't it? The reason why we think that on a risk-based approach we can leave some of those really historic alerts to one side is because we think from our analysis that we'll pick up the same cases through VEPs and do it more effectively, more quickly. I mean, I think what people will want to know is that we're treating, in cases of overpayment where we need to recover the debt, and in answer to Mr. Stevens' points as well, and Mr. McCabe's, we want that we are treating them fairly and according to their circumstances, and that's the thing we need to make sure we're doing. And as I said earlier, I'm very keen, I've asked for a research plan for getting an understanding about the impact of our repayment arrangements in terms of the people who we're recovering it from.
But VEPS is picking up, the NAO report said, around 30% of matches each month,
yeah.
and that's only 70% of the total anyway, so that's around 21% of cases are being matched under VEPS. So what are the guarantees that we're not going to end up with people falling through that net, the sort of 79% of cases that aren't checked, and falling into long-term arrears again?
So at 70% of cases we can use VEPS works, and we'll try and push that up towards 100% when we sort out the issues that the NAO raise on things like the date of birth sort of software element. And then the other statistic, I think what you're looking at, of the 70%, how many, so we're looking at the 70% of the population. Mm. And then we get alerts coming in if the RTI feed suggests that that the earnings are above the earnings threshold. Yeah. What we're finding is it's an increasing rate. On pension credit we've got to 50%, but around a significant proportion of those it was worth looking into because we found an overpayment at which we could stop. Obviously there'll be a significant proportion that we look at and say, well, RTI shows that your earnings were above the threshold, but then we talk to the claimant and say, yeah, but I'm claiming for alternative care costs, and these are the amounts. I'm claiming for contributions to pensions or whatever it is, and the net amount goes down. So although you had the alert, it hasn't identified an overpayment. It's just been a signal that we need to talk to the claimant. So that's why I'm confident. I mean, as you say, the challenge is, can we extend it to closer to 100% of the population?
I mean, this is an incredibly complex procedure, is it not, with the deductions that are going on and the allowances that are there, and with people with more fluctuating earnings in this day and age as employment becomes more flexible. As you were saying with universal credit, it's a calculation that needs to be made each and every week to see whether somebody comes over the threshold or not. have you got enough staff to be able to both deal with those claims, deal with new claims coming forward, and also to make sure, as you said, that you take individual circumstances into account in cases of overpayment? Because you're not been coping at the moment, so how are you going to cope with managing this system going forward?
Well, it's a really good challenge. I think the data that the NEO have pulled together shows that the backlogs are all down to a level that we need for just ongoing normal operation. I think the real challenge is, can we keep them at that level? I mean, Emma might want to say a little bit about our approach to thinking about resourcing going forward, so we're ahead of the curve that Amyas described before rather than behind it.
Okay, and the NEO report said that it was impacting on new claims being made. That went up to the end of March. What staffing changes have been made since the end of March within the Carers Allowance unit?
So I think the most instructive table I found on this was figure 14 on page 31, which I think, can I just check this addresses your question, Ms. George, but what you see is that the yellow line is new claims for carers allowance, which peaked at around September 2017. And so the challenge for us, and I think this was the right decision, the challenge was us to put scarce resource onto addressing the backlog of new claims, because what you really want to do is a new claim, you want to get them the money as soon as possible. So we addressed that. But what you also saw was a continuing rise, so that's the orange and the red, a rise in the number of changes of circumstance that we hadn't processed. Now, a change of circumstance, if someone has told us about a change of circumstance and we haven't processed that, then ultimately we're paying people overpayment. It's our fault, so we'll never be able to recover it anyway. But we have finally got a grip of that, and you see that this peaked at around November 2018 and has come down, and it's now down. The latest numbers, I think, show it to be now at a level that are at the level that we'd want them to be for an efficient organisation going forward. But the challenge is a good one that you and Amyas are both raising, which is, how do you make sure that you keep resourcing in a world of a tight expenditure limit? How do we know that we're always anticipating future pressures and we're ahead of the game? And I don't know, Emma, whether you want to answer that or address that.
I mean, I was going to ask, because the temporary staff were taken on in order to deal with that bulge, were they not? And presumably, with the amount of work you've got going forward to keep on top of this, you would be keeping those temporary staff in place. Has that happened?
Do you want to address that? Yeah.
So we do have a mixture of temporary and permanent staff in the carers unit at the moment. We're actually over-resourced to have dealt with the backlogs, obviously, because you need extra people to deal with all the new work coming in as well as clearing backlogs. We will gradually have to bring the staffing down to the right level that is just the level that keeps up with intake each week and the acceptable head of work. That includes the VEP Alerts team as well in Newcastle. So that will be a mixture of, yes, some of the temporary staff might not stay, or or they might. You know, we look at resourcing across the whole of DWP operations.
Did they have the option of staying? Have they had the option of staying after March? I don't remember specifically for the fixed term contract appointees in carers. Some of those we extended, and some will be looked at as we move forward. Lots of different fixed term contracts have different end dates. Okay, would you be able to let us know what the level of staffing was up until now, and what it will be going forward? Yeah. Because that's important. Because I understand that there's a significant number of phone calls to the Carers Allowance unit have not been answered in recent weeks, and that will obviously impact on all the people who are trying to phone up and report a change of circumstances, ask for advice. It's a very intensive system, as you've set out. How are they going to actually manage that system when the phone isn't being answered?
Yeah. Well, I've actually looked at our performance on telephony over recent weeks and months, and we've sustained a very acceptable service, actually, of the number of calls that we've answered.
And the good thing in carers unit as well is that 95% of those calls, we solve the query there and then, once and done. Customer doesn't have to get handed off to anybody else, and we don't have to call them back. that 5% is where it needs to go to some specialist decision maker or that kind of thing. So actually keeping on top of the calls has stopped that backlog growing any further.
So what's the acceptable level?
Yeah, and what proportion of calls are answered?
I think it's been about the 85% mark.
You think? You said you
I'd need to look up the exact figures for you, but
that's acceptable. 85 is.
That's comparable with the other product lines. Yeah.
Okay, well, could you let us know, because that's still sort of 15% of people, carers with chaotic lives, who are trying to get through and not able to report these changes of circumstances and have that conversation.
Able to get through and not able to get through. We've ensured that on new claims we haven't had any blocked calls, so they might have had to call back, you're right, to get through, but they haven't just had an engaged tone or not been answered at all.
Yeah, so you get through. The 85% is that some people, and it goes back to people's lives, they can't, if we've got a peak in call waiting, then they might not be able to wait. At that point, they put the phone down. You hope they then are able to phone back again when it's more convenient.
Okay, thank you. Your published estimates of fraud and error overall show total underpayments across all benefits of about 1.7 billion, but they don't include the late payments or the payments of arrears such as these. So how many people does the department pay late, and by how much?
Sorry, the question is...
The question is on the total underpayments, because you said that those underpayments were as important to you as overpayments. Yeah. They don't include late payments or payments of arrears. How many people does the department pay late, and by how much?
I don't think I've got a number for that. I can tell you that the underpayment number that we published last week was 1.1 billion. So it's half of it's 2.2 billion was overpayments, 1.1 billion is underpayments, but my focus is on trying to get both those numbers down. In terms of late payments, we have a particular focus on universal credit, for example, where that's part of my regular dashboard, and we publish those numbers on a regular basis, and we're still universal credit payment timeliness is around the 80 to 85% consistently.
Okay. Would you be able to let us have those figures for carers allowance in particular?
Yeah, sure. We'll let you have that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Steve.
Thanks. Fraud and error are currently at record levels, and I understand overpayments are costing the government about $3 billion a year. Can you say confidently that you're on top of this?
So we put the statistics out last week. The number, I think, of overpayments was 2.2 billion, and which was about the same as a percentage. Sorry, no, it isn't. Sorry, I'm getting my numbers confused. 2.2%, 4 billion. Yeah. And you're right. The underpayments is 1.1%. Sorry, I got that wrong. It's about 2 billion. Let me correct the record on that. So at 2.2%, that is the same as it was in the previous year. It's higher than I'd want it to be.
So where would you want it? I mean, 3 billion sounds like a lot of money to write off to me. Where would you want it to be?
And I've had this conversation with the committee, I think, before, but also the Public Accounts Committee. Ultimately, there is always a balance here, and it was picked up by Amyas earlier. Ultimately, there is a sweet spot here where the amount of money we're spending detecting, tracking down, recovering is worthwhile for the amount that we're collecting. You can get to the point where you are chasing this down and you're not making, it's not worthwhile doing. But we're not there yet. And so what we've done is we are getting to the heart of the root causes of overpayment and underpayment, benefit by benefit. Laura leads on this, and she's got this fantastic heat map that will interrogate each of the benefits and what the causes of loss or overpayment or underpayment are. So it might be that we are overpaying because people haven't reported earnings. It might be that we're underpaying, another serious situation, where someone is on a disability benefit and their condition has deteriorated and they haven't told us and we haven't picked that up. So it works both ways. And I don't think I yet know the answer to the point of what would be, where is that sweet spot? And I think I don't yet know that answer for two reasons. One is we're still building our evidence base. And then the second thing is as new technology comes in, so we can more effectively, with less resource, and you're seeing that with VEX as a classic example of that, with less resource, I can track down more overpayment. And therefore, you as a committee and the wider stakeholders should expect me to do better on driving down fraud and error when I've got new technology that makes it cheaper to pursue more overpayments and also identify more underpayments than it was in the past. So it's a moving picture. The key thing is to assure you and the rest of the committee that we are building a better understanding about how this works in the context of a strategy which is reviewed every year by the National Audit Office. And,
you think it's getting better? Can I just ask?
So it's getting better. I mean, isn't it fair to say that your level of overpayments and underpayments were the joint highest ever last year?
So the percentage was the same as the year before, but because we're paying more benefits, the actual cash amount was higher. That's true.
It's hard from either of those to get the view that things are getting better, isn't it?
Well, and so there are two things that we need to be aware of there. One is universal credit brings a different customer base into DWP where there are more areas of risk. So if you look at our population group, our customer group, we have very low levels of overpayment in the state pension because of the design of the pension and the fact that there aren't it's a fixed sum and changes of circumstance aren't going to affect people's entitlement to that. Whereas when you've got a working age population where you have where you've got to take into account things like not just earnings but whether people are living together and declaring that as a household, whether people have got capital that they're declaring, whether people have got whether people are going abroad for longer than they're entitled to on the benefit. These are difficult things to pick up. And so what you're seeing is the demographics of the people that we serve covered by the overarching figures for DWP are including more people who are coming across from, say, HMRC, where they might previously be on tax credits. That's one thing. And second, I think, the challenge of fraud is a growing one, and we've got to make sure our systems are alert to that. Sometimes I wonder whether we're better at identifying fraud, and therefore it reflects in the numbers. But I mean, I'm not going to use that as an excuse. But we've got to take that into account. For me, and Amyas and the NAO and Amyas' successor will always look at our accounts and decide whether to qualify them based on, I'm sure, on the overall number. But for me, it's having a handle, benefit by benefit, source of error by source of error, and knowing that in each of those boxes in that matrix, we have a strategy that in a value for money way is really driving out improvement and getting to the heart of this. And that's what the strategy is all about. Laura leads on it. As I say, NAO look at this every year, and certainly last year when they looked at the strategy, they were reasonably satisfied that we were doing the right thing. I mean, the final thing, I guess, is just to pick up a point around what we measure. And as the report says, we have not actually measured, the high levels of overpayment in carers' allowance. But that is something that we will do, and we have started the work ahead of next year's statistics.
So is it true that in terms of carers' allowance, we have an estimate of what you think the fraud and error is based on a measure that was done over 20 years ago, 1997. Is that accurate? So
there are...
So, I mean, if we're looking at figures and relying on you, that's a pretty tenuous grasp, isn't it?
Well, no, because, I mean, this report is full of data.
Yeah, I know, but I'm saying, is it true that the measure was last done in 1997?
So the last time we did...
Maybe not that up to date, yeah.
No, sorry, there is a lot of up-to-date data about circumstances.
Yeah, but I'm asking about, is it true that the measure was in 1997? Is that accurate?
Sorry, the management information in here is all up-to-date management information and data. The specific thing you're talking about is when we pull together our global figures for fraud and error, we don't sample every single benefit each and every year. for the reason that Joshua described earlier. It's incredibly expensive. And you always have to ask yourself a question, are we better off spending money measuring fraud and error, or are we better off spending money tackling fraud and error? Now, clearly you've got to have a combination of the two to know that you're directing things in the right
But
place.
with all these new systems, is it really that difficult to actually produce an annual measure?
No, the new systems give you the data that we're talking about. But what you need to do in order to give you the global figure is you've got to take a sample of the population of people on carers allowance. You've got to dig into their individual lives, and you've got to say, hang on, should they really have been receiving carers allowance, understanding their circumstances. You've got to do that claimant by claimant. That's why it's really resource intense. But notwithstanding that, you know,
and do you do one every 20 years? Is that about it?
Well, for carers allowance, no. For a lot of benefits, we do it every year.
Right, but not
where
carers
they're
allowance.
big scale. I mean, carers allowance, we spend a lot of money on carers allowance, but if you think in the context of an overall organisation where we spend £180 billion on benefits, it's still a relatively small amount of money. So with the finite resource I've got on measuring, I put it in the places where, one, it's the largest amounts, and two, experience in the past at least has suggested that the likelihood of change is greater from one year to the next. But the NAO have made an absolutely fair challenge, particularly looking at the growth in carers allowance over the last 10 years. They've said, hang on, you can't go on saying carers allowance is static. So, you know, it's quite right. So we're putting the resource in this year to measure carers allowance, and that will do through 1920, so you get the stats this time next year.
Okay, thank you.
So, just one couple of last things then. So, Laura, apparently you have a strategy for fraud and error on carers allowance. Does that include a target for where you'll get the amounts to by a certain date?
We haven't got targets which are at the level of individual benefits. We
Why?
do understand at the level of individual benefits where our main causes of loss are. And the reason is because what we are, obviously the benefits all have conditions, and we find the same cause of loss across a number of different benefits. So VEPS is a really useful illustration of how we approach this. So when you have a cause of loss which is unreported earnings, the solution to that is one data set. So the solution to that is how we've taken RTI, we've developed it through VEP, and in Universal Credit we're feeding it directly into the system. So that solution, that data solution, goes across multiple benefits. So that's how we're focusing on this. So we have this year created a risk and intelligence service, and they are also doing really focused work around our other main causes of loss. So how we can use data analytics to understand whether people are living together, how we can approach capital. So that's the approach we're taking. We're taking it by cause of loss, by cause of loss. But we do also have, I do also have groups that look intensively at particular areas. So for carers allowance, yes, we haven't had an external measure, but we do regularly look at the overpayments detected, the causes of those. We also have quality people, and they are feeding back into our risk and intelligence service so we can understand the root cause. So that's the approach that we are taking.
So you have a strategy, but you don't know where you're starting from or where you're trying to get to. But other than that, it's going to work. Because you do have a target for how much you're going to save using VEPs on carers allowance overpayment, don't you?
Yes, we do. And
so you can't have a target for how much you're going to get the fraud down by, but you can have a target for how much return you're going to get from a new piece of software.
I think... Sorry.
Well, it's just, it goes back to the point, what is the most direct way into understanding whether the system is working? And here we have a business case for VEPs, and we can identify across a range of benefits the return that we're getting.
Yes, what you're really saying is when you want a business case to spend some money on something you want, you can have a target. When you don't want to be held to account on something, then you don't want a target. I mean, that strikes me as being...
That's not fair. That's not fair. It's just that the analysis was done that enabled us to understand the nature of the potential when we look at tracking, addressing earnings, fraud or overpayments.
But I assume that calculation was how much are we losing at the moment, how much will we lose if we have this software, and the difference is how much we can save. That's kind of what we're asking you to say. What can you get overpayments of carers allowance down to by a certain period? I mean, isn't that not just the same calculation, just presented slightly differently?
Well, Laura's point is that when we look at VEPs, and increasingly what we're trying to do, we're looking not benefit by benefit, but we're looking cause of loss by cause of loss. And so, you know, in the same way, just because people on carers allowance will be on a range of other benefits as well, potentially, So it's, and the cause of loss will be the same. So I'm just trying to make sure we're talking about meaningful indicators. For me, it goes back to this 2x2 matrix. It's understanding in each of those elements. And I mean, we'll take the NAO through all of this in their review, and I'm sure they'll report that.
I suppose for us, we don't want to get back here in 3 years' time with another out-of-control set of overpayments on carers allowance. So we'd have liked there to be some data and targets that we could be confident you were monitoring and checking, that we could see published and know that this is under control and getting more under control, because we don't want people to have the pain of having to repay something that they probably should never have had. There's a final question. If I'm a carer watching this and who's thinking, well, I can't be absolutely sure that I didn't earn too much in 1 week in 2012 and I might get a bill coming soon. I mean, can they be reassured that actually there isn't going to be a sort of a thorough trawl through of everybody's minor potential infractions going back a hell of a long time, that actually, if they haven't been contacted by now, they can probably rest easy that innocent mistakes are not going to come back to haunt them?
Well, I think the right thing to do is always just to declare your circumstances to the DWP, and we will treat people fairly. We have rules that we have to follow, but hopefully I've talked you through the approach to repayments in particular, where we take into account people's circumstances and we treat people fairly, and that I think is what people will ask. Everyone looking in on this will ask of us in the role that we've got.
Okay, well, thank you for your time. That's the session closed. Order.